Thank you very much. Okay, well, let me be the first to welcome you and thank you for attending for our fourth webinar in this year's installment of the Duchess Land Conservancy's Earth Matters webinar series. My name is Brian Srinidi, and I'm the Outreach and Preserve Manager with the Duchess Land Conservancy. Tonight, we're more than thrilled to welcome Dr. Charlie Canham, a Senior Scientist Emeritus at the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies. Before we get started tonight, my role is to go over the basic logistics about this webinar. And after that, our Education Director, Julie Hart, will provide a brief introduction to the Duchess Land Conservancy and tonight's presenter. First, you are muted and chat is disabled for this event to ensure that there's no interruption during the presentation. Second, the raise hand function is disabled. We ask you to enter all questions into the Q&A box at any point during the presentation. You can access this box at the bottom center of your screen. Questions will be addressed when the presentation is done or by our team during the presentation if possible. If there are a great deal of questions, we'll try to combine them based on topics as well. Third, closed captioning is enabled for this event. To turn on this function, please select the CC icon located at the bottom of your screen. And finally, I'll hand it over to Julie, who will tell us a bit about the DLC, this webinar series, and our guest presenter tonight. Julie.
Thank you, Brian. I'm Julie Hart, an ecologist and educator here at the Duchess Land Conservancy, and I'm glad that you all could join us this evening. Many of you are probably familiar with the DLC, but for anyone who's not, let me give you a quick overview. Duchess Land Conservancy is a private nonprofit land conservation organization located in the Hudson Valley of New York State, and we're dedicated to preserving the farms and forests, wetlands and waterways, open spaces, and wildlife habitats of Dutchess County. We are an accredited land trust, and since our founding in 1985, we've worked with hundreds of landowners and protected over 47,000 acres of land. We're grateful to all of these conservation-minded folks and grateful to our sponsors, the Molly B. Schaefer Education Fund, Labella Associates, Structure Works, and Mutual of America. We're really glad that you can be here for our fourth season of Earth Matters, the DLC's winter webinar series. On the first Wednesday of each month through April, we bring you a fascinating speaker with lots to teach us. And this season, we're learning about the wonders of trees and forests and the important ecological roles that they play. I hope that these webinars will help you to see the trees and forests around you in a new way, to read the stories that can be found in their branches and buds, to see the connections between trees and the wildlife they support, and to find a new appreciation for these diverse and resilient communities called forests. So it's a real pleasure to welcome Dr. Charlie Canham to our webinar series. He was very naturally one of the first people who came to mind when we decided on our theme for this season. As a senior scientist, now emeritus at the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies, which, as you probably know, is just down the road from us here at the DLC. And his research is foundationally relevant to the work of land conservation. I know that my experience, and full disclosure, I used to work at the Cary Institute and I worked on some of Charlie's projects. And that work really helped to form my views of the world. I came there as a freshly minted college graduate who, in retrospect, didn't know a whole lot. And I learned a lot by getting out in the field. And I think two things strike me as being very parallel between ecology research and land conservation. And those are the collaborative nature of both of those things, that we can achieve more together through our collaborations with partners than we can alone. And also the complexity of the systems, the trying to understand the complexity and the interconnectedness of ecological systems really helps me in the land trust world to understand the complexity of what we're trying to do as people who are working to conserve land, and also as an educator to try to explain these very difficult ecological concepts to landowners who are asking very basic questions about how to manage their land in a more ecologically responsible way. So I'm really, really grateful to all that I've learned from Charlie over the years. I often find myself spouting some Charlie-isms when I'm educating folks about forest dynamics and land history. So a little bit of a biography. Charlie began his career with degrees in botany from Montana State University and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And from there, he earned his PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from Cornell University. He joined the Cary scientific staff in 1984, and his primary research interests have focused on the ecology and management of temperate forests, particularly in the eastern United States, as well as in Canada and New Zealand. He's the author or co-author of more than 140 articles in the peer-reviewed literature, and in 2020 published a very wonderful book called Forests Adrift, Currents Shaping the Future of Northeastern Trees through the Yale University Press. And I'll include links to both of those in the follow-up email if you're interested in reading more of Charlie's work. And so with that, I will stop sharing my screen, and Charlie, you can start sharing yours. And I'll turn it over to Charlie, who can help us to understand the ecological history of Hudson Valley forests.
There we go. Let's see. Let's try this. And let me get screens organized here a little bit. So, Julie, are you seeing my slides?
Yep, looks good. We're on your introductory slide.
Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you, Julie and Brian and DLC, and thanks to all of you who chose to join us this evening. I'm delighted to talk. I'd much prefer if we were all taking a walk in the woods, but these webinars have turned out, this is maybe a COVID legacy. We've discovered that we can, more people can get together in this format. So I'm going to talk about an ecological history of Hudson Valley forests. And a lot of what I'll talk about comes from this book that I published right at the beginning of the pandemic. In fact, a horrible time to release a book. But the title of the book is deliberate, Forests Adrift. So ecologists are enamored of the word resilience. And we like to think of ecological systems as having resilience. But in traditional terms, that often meant that a system could absorb disturbance or some sort of pulse or stress and then return to some primeval or equilibrial state. As you'll discover during this talk, that's not the way I've come to think about forests. I think that forests do, in fact, drift. They move along in response to many currents. And as I'll get to by the end, conclude that they rarely ever return to their original state. So if you study things that live hundreds of years, and most of our tree species are capable of living 300 to 400 years, you get used to thinking about history. And so when I think about what I see in the forested landscape today, I have to be willing to go back not just hundreds, but even thousands of years to understand the legacies, the currents that have created the conditions we see before us. And so tonight I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about the nature of the region prior to European settlement, including some highly speculative thoughts on Native American impacts, partly because we know relatively little, in fact. And then I'm just going to walk through the things that I think are shaping, have shaped and will shape the future of these forests. In fact, those bullet points largely correspond to chapters in the book. So, we're all, particularly conservation organizations, are enamored of this notion of sort of the primeval state, nature as this untrammeled wilderness. Conservation organizations are learning to move away from this, but it's worth asking what we know about the nature of this landscape, prior to European settlement and during a period of about 12,000 years since the retreat of the glaciers, when there was both dramatic change in climate as well as the arrival of humans in North America, in this part of North America, at least as the glaciers retreated. So what we know about that period, in particular about the forest, comes from a group of very dedicated scientists known as palynologists. These are people who go out and take a sediment core from the bottom of a lake, take it back to the lab, and then carefully slice out bits of the mud, dissolve it under a slide, and then count the pollen grains of the trees and the plants that deposited pollen on the surface of the lake that then settled into the sediments. It's remarkably painstaking and frankly painful work. It's not uncommon for a postdoc or a grad student to spend a year or more processing one of these cores. And I picked two of my favorite lakes, Sutherland Pond. Those of you who know Black Rock Forest, probably my favorite place in the Hudson Valley. I grew up at West Point, and Black Rock was where my wife and I, then girlfriend and I, would go to hike. And Sutherland Pond has really a spectacular pollen diagram put together by Terry Ann Menzig-Melch with very high resolution. Those of you who've been to the Adirondacks and to the high peaks know Heart Lake at the foot of the high peaks near Mount Marcy. And so these are just give you a sense of the change. So the way you read these is you know, from left to right, you're going deeper and deeper into the lake and deeper into history. And I'll start with Sutherland Pond. You know, about between 10,000 and 12,000 years ago, the period known as the Younger Dryas, after the initial warming that triggered the retreat of the glaciers, there was this sudden cold spell that lasted a couple thousand years. Various explanations having to do with ocean currents, typically for this. And there's this period of spruce, fir, and pine. There was probably tundra mixed in. The birch pollen were probably some of the shrubby, more tundra-like birch species. But then about 9,000 years ago, oaks begin to dominate in the Hudson Highlands. And if you look at the axes, the y-axis there, oak pollen has been more than half of the tree pollen falling on the surface of Sutherland Pond for 9,000 years. And that's a pretty remarkably stable pattern. You see other species fluctuating. I really don't know why birch started showing up 3,000 years ago in the Hudson Highlands. It's not clear exactly what species that is. Probably black birch, I would guess. But Heart Lake has a very different story and shows much more variability. You still see that Younger Dryas period with the spruce, fir, and pine. But the most distinctive thing in Heart Lake is this decline in hemlock about 5,000 years ago. It turns out hundreds of lakes have been studied this way around the Northeast, and they essentially all show an effectively synchronous and very precipitous, almost elimination of eastern hemlock from the landscape. Margaret Davis, one of the pioneers of this field of work, was really the first to suggest that this was probably due to some introduced pest or pathogen, although it's not clear who or how it would have been introduced. But it's really hard to explain this as any sort of a climate signal. And so it's really a dramatic pattern. What you see then is that beech, birch, and maple both seem to benefit. So there's certainly climate signals in all of that, but there are a couple of messages I take from this. And the first is that it's very hard to argue that at any time in the last 12,000 years, these forests have been in perfect equilibrium with climate. And the other is that events like the decline of hemlock can have transient dynamics that play out over hundreds and thousands of years. In fact, we predicted from a model that that pattern of beech rising and then falling and hemlock rising and falling after the initial decline could well simply be successional dynamics, not related to a climate change at all. So there certainly are systems like the Hudson Highlands where oaks have been a reliably and consistently dominant species for almost 10,000 years. But in most of the other forests around the Northeast, you're going to see something more like Heart Lake, where there's just a lot of variability over time. And so this, naturally leads us to think about the impacts of Native Americans who would have been present in those early forests. And there are really three themes that are woven through thinking about Native American impacts on the Northeastern landscape. The first is, of course, this very dramatic extinction of the Pleistocene megafauna. So more than 90 genera of mammals, basically anything larger than the bison, went extinct in North America right around this time, around 10, 12,000 years ago. Some of them species like mastodons or lasting into 6,000 years ago in isolated islands. In the 1960s, it was first proposed that this was tied to the arrival of what was known as Clovis man. So the Native Americans with a very distinctive Clovis arrowhead. And so that hunting was considered to be a major cause of this. There were also very dramatic changes in climate and habitat, obviously. So we really have no way of knowing. I personally think it had to have been a combination of both, because there had been 5 or 6 of these previous glacial, interglacial periods in the 2 million years before this, in which these animals had been present but did not go extinct until humans arrived in North America. A more immediate impact is this notion that fire, so that lake sediment core at Sutherland Pond, not only is there oak pollen all the way through, but there's charcoal all the way through. So clearly fires were burning in the Hudson Highlands throughout the last 10,000 years. And again, back in the 60s and 70s, it was commonly asserted that the fires were being deliberately set by Native Americans as a form of habitat management to keep the understory open, to promote berry crops, things like that, and allow hunting. Although in practice, it turns out that Emily Russell Southgate, who's a very prominent historical ecologist, went back to the original records, and it turns out no one actually ever saw Native Americans. None of the writers at these early botanical explorers in the late 1600s, early 1700s who were writing about Indian-caused fires, none of them actually admitted ever seeing an Indian set of fire. The fact remains that fires were present in the landscape, and a common factor. Unlike the West, where dry lightning is a fairly common event, it's a rare event here. So it was just always assumed there needed to be a human source of ignition for the fires. But we really do not know the role that Native Americans played in this. I used to joke that it was probably teenagers having, parties and let the campfire get loose that started the fires, but we really don't know. And then, in contrast to the just dramatic transformation of the landscape once European agriculture arrived, we really don't have a good handle on just how extensive Native American agriculture was. Corn really doesn't arrive in the Northeast in this part of the country until about 1,000 years ago. So the assumption has always been that clearing for agriculture was limited to the better soils and probably a fairly small portion of the landscape. But all of this changes when European farmers arrive. Of course, it changes even when the first Europeans arrive and spread disease and conflict with Native Americans and decimate those communities. But from a forest point of view, the real transformation of this landscape happens, once farmers arrive. So in Dutchess County, and I don't know where all of you are from, but where I'm from and where DLC is based, a big chunk of the area around towns of Millbrook and Stanford and Clinton, where I live, were part of what's called the Great Nine Partners patent, about 150,000 acres bought in 1697 by a group of land speculators from Manhattan, who, as best I can tell, bought this land because it had the last few miles of unclaimed river frontage between Manhattan and Albany in 1697. The rest of the county at that time was basically wilderness. Settlers were along the river. They were over in Connecticut along the Housatonic, but the towns of Washington, Stanford, and Clinton were basically, had essentially no farming activity. They bought the land and mostly trapped beaver for the hat trade in London until the English crown forced them to survey the land and begin to sell it off to farmers. And so the first farms here in this sort of central Dutchess County really don't appear until 1730, 1740, and begin to clear small plots. Wheat was the cash crop, the most valuable crop they could raise, even if it was only on a couple of acres. I guess I have to say that the soils in Dutchess County are famously poor. And these farms were on very thin, rocky soils. And very quickly, yields started to decline. In fact, by the 1780s, Hessian fly and wheat rust appeared. So Hessian fly, an insect that attacks wheat, particularly when it's planted in the spring, was devastating wheat crops throughout everywhere from Long Island up through the Hudson Valley. This was considered such an issue that Thomas Jefferson got himself appointed to a commission by the American Philosophical Society to investigate the problem. And he and James Madison took a jaunt up through, they took a cutter up to Peekskill and then up to Poughkeepsie, and then met their carriages and then traveled through farms up through the Hudson Valley, talking to farmers about what could be done about this devastating loss of crop and income. And so, a typical farm might only have 5-10 acres of cultivated fields and the rest some pasture and then woodlots. But if I had to pick a date that was probably the most significant ecological date in the history of the Hudson Valley, it would be 1825 and the opening of the Erie Canal. I live in the town of Clinton. This graph would be true for both the towns of Washington and Stanford. Basically, the population of our town peaked in the 1820 census and didn't exceed that until 1950, until actually 1960. And so basically, when the Erie Canal opened, yes, you could move. Basically, farmers got up and moved west. They moved to the Ohio Valley. The value of the Erie Canal was not that it allowed you to get there. It was that you could sell your produce back through the canal, down the locks at Albany, down the river, and then all the way market your grain and your hogs and your produce all the way to Europe. And so farming really transformed. And so, 1825 is when we see the first land abandonment. If your neighbor moved and you decided not to, you would buy their land and take his best field and your best field, keep them in production, and begin to diversify. So, things like, sheep and dairy and orchards all began to become more common, but the intensity of the use of the land really faded. And so you began to see white pine coming in on these abandoned fields. And by the late 1800s, white pine was probably the most valuable crop on Hudson Valley farms, particularly with the growth of the New York City and the cities and the need for timber for buildings. White pine coming in on these fields was a very valuable resource. As it was cut, it was being replaced by hardwoods. And so, so the question becomes, we went from a landscape that was basically 100% forested, with the exception of maybe the 5 to 8% that was in wetlands here in the Hudson Valley, to, by 1920, certainly, even though some land had been abandoned, and there's an old agricultural extension bulletin for Dutchess County that estimated that 20% of Dutchess County remained in forest, that 80% of it had been, quote, improved. And that's probably the low water mark for forest cover. Dutchess County is now 55% forested. And so the question is, have these forests recovered? Have they returned to anything like what they were before then? And the answer is, well, in some ways, yes, and in many ways, no. So what's missing from these forests? I'm a tree person, and I'm very proud of the fact that the trees were the things that came back most effectively. But a lot of the understory that had been present, particularly the richer site, I picked 3 species here, all of which like slightly richer soils, and were probably pretty rare in Dutchess County forests prior to settlement: maidenhair, likes a more base-rich, a higher pH soil, and Dutchman's breeches and trout lily like a fairly fertile soil as spring ephemerals. They're the things that don't come back quickly after a land has gone through the plow and grazing. And so, if you find these in the woods, it's quite often the case that you're finding them in one of the few bits of the less than a third of current forests that never were put into agriculture. And there have been various estimates that it could be centuries for the native forest understory, the wildflowers and the shrubs, to reestablish. In fact, one of the best indicators of the land use history in forests in this part of Dutchess County is the presence of maple leaf viburnum, one of the common viburnum species. Viburnums are a large native genus of shrubs. Many of them you probably have, some of you have them planted in your gardens. There are a lot of ornamental cultivars of viburnums, but maple leaf viburnum, when we did the original study of the forests at the Cary and we reconstructed the land use history, we discovered that maple leaf viburnum was only found in the former woodlots, the lands that had never been cleared. The odd part of this story is that it's been 70, 80, even 100 years since forests have become reestablished on abandoned agricultural land. It's exceedingly rare to find maple leaf viburnum spreading out of those woodlot forests across the stone wall and into the post-agricultural forest. I'll jump ahead to thinking about deer. About 20 years ago, we put about an acre of deer fence around the woods around our house, and I'm now seeing maple leaf viburnum come into my woods. So yes, there are, we have most of our native tree species back, but that does not mean the entire forest has been reassembled. The other thing about this is that we get very different forests based on the nature of the land use immediately prior to abandonment. So cultivated fields that were abandoned tend to be colonized pretty quickly by a certain group of species. These are trees with moderate-sized wind-dispersed seeds. So they've got to be small enough to blow into the field, but then large enough to help them get established. And these forests, they're dominated now by red maple, white pine, white ash, things like that. We have some tulip poplar in there, some birches. But oaks are largely absent, except along the hedgerows. On the other hand, if the land was in pasture when it was abandoned, we often find oaks in those forests, but only after a long period of oldfield succession dominated by one of my favorite plants, little bluestem grass. Thinking is that the oaks are there in part because farmers left oaks in their pastures, both for shade for livestock as well as the acorns were food for livestock, particularly pigs. But what I want to point out about this is that neither of these forests types, these mixes of species, has any analog in the previous 10,000 years of ecological history. These are both novel ecosystems. I mean, there's a lot of talk in ecological circles about climate change creating novel ecosystems, things that are just novel, that we're not making a value judgment there, although there is sort of an implicit value judgment that these aren't natural. These are fully functioning forest ecosystems. They just have no analog in the post-glacial history. These are new. These are a product of human land use history. But I want to shift and talk a bit about the highlands. So both the woodlots at the Cary Institute are all on steep slopes. These are the lands that, the small fraction of the landscape that just couldn't be plowed or put into pasture. But the Catskills and the Hudson Highlands have a distinct history of their own. And particularly the Catskills are worth thinking about. It's hard to wrap your mind around just how intensive the forestry was in the highlands. particularly in the Catskills, there was a lot of hemlock in the Catskills in the early 1800s, and the Catskills became one of the country's main centers for the tanning industry. So the hides were shipped up from Argentina on clipper ships and then hauled up into the Catskills. The hemlock was being cut, the bark was being stripped and taken to the tanneries. The trees were left to rot on the ground. Most of the rest of the forest was cut down for fuel and timber. It's just by 1840, 1850, basically the hemlock was depleted, gone, and the tanning industry moved up to the slopes, the southern slopes of the Adirondacks. Barbara McMartin has a wonderful book on the tanning industry in New York that's worth looking at. Bob McIntosh, an early, very prominent ecologist in the 60s, used witness tree records and documented that hemlock today is just a fraction of its abundance, the abundance present prior to the tanning industry. And so the tanning industry depleted hemlock. Hemlock doesn't sprout from the cut stump or from roots, and so it just didn't regenerate. And so there's far less hemlock in the Catskills than there was 250 years ago. You know, it's interesting that the public reaction to early logging was almost as negative as most public reaction to logging is today, which I find strange. I don't understand that, I have to confess. But the public saw even early forestry as destructive and a threat to water supplies, for instance, and both of those were true. For instance, imagine the effluent coming out of these tanneries into these now world-famous trout streams in the Catskills. In 1840, those streams must have been dead. You know, the effluent would have just been brutal. But as an ecologist, I have to say that the ecological legacies of this forestry were far less important than the ecological legacies of clearing for agriculture. So for instance, you know, years ago, Barbara McMartin, Ed Ketledge, Peter Marks, and I, all ecologists, went to visit stands that we knew had the spruce logged out of them before the Adirondack Park was formed, and asked ourselves, could we see any impact of that on the current forest? And we concluded that we couldn't. It had been 100 years. Only really the spruce were logged out. This was before the trains were around, and only the conifers could be floated down the rivers. So yes, it was highly visible to the public, but 100 years later, you know, that logging in the winter had very little impact on the understory, so the understory was not really impacted. If I had to point to an impact of that logging, it would be this. One of the most remarkable bits of New York history, which is Article 14, the Forever Wild Clause of our Constitution, adopted in 1894. It's worth, if you don't know the history of this, it's worth reading the history of the Adirondack Park and the Catskill Park and the shenanigans that went on, and just the almost miracle that this Constitution was adopted in 1894. But because of it, there are 2.7 million acres of land in the Adirondacks and almost over 250,000 acres in the Catskills that frankly have the strictest legal protection for wilderness character of any lands in the country, because it's written into our Constitution. It's not just an act of the legislature. But the other legacy of this early logging was this concern about fire. So particularly in the Adirondacks, this was not an issue here in the Hudson Valley so much, but there were massive fires in 1903. This fire burned more than 400,000 acres, consumed several whole small towns, killed a lot of people. Similar area burned in 1908. A lot of this was due to sparks thrown off by the railroads being put in for logging. But the fact of the matter is that because of this and this concern about wildfires, we ended up with fire towers all over the country. And so, you know, fire suppression became almost a religion in forest management. And there are still fire towers. Many of you have probably been up Stissing Mountain. Ferncliff Forest has one. They're delightful as a way to get a view of the landscape. But from the period of about 1920 to about 1950, they would have been manned, and they're it's still policy in New York State with DEC to put out a fire as rapidly as possible, regardless of conditions. I think it is pretty close to consensus among ecologists that this fire suppression has played a principal role in a reduction in the dominance of oaks. Oaks have nice thick bark. They tend to be tolerant of light ground fires, and they need a fair bit of light to regenerate. And so fires are believed to create periodic fires, maybe every 5 to 10, 15 years. A light ground fire is pretty ideal, creates pretty ideal conditions for oak regeneration. The other interesting thing about the East is that in the West, 100 years of fire suppression has dramatically increased the threat of fire. In the East, almost exactly the opposite has happened. So, as most of you know, I'm sure New York State has a fire ban from March 15th to May 15th, I think. Don't quote me on those dates. I think those are the dates. And the reason is that oak leaves are the primary fuel for our spring fires. Oak leaves have a lot of lignin and relative to the amount of nitrogen, and they don't decompose sufficiently over the winter to form a nice moist mat on the ground. So they're still intact. They dry out in the spring, in a warm spring day when there's a lot of sunlight. The leaves aren't out in the canopy. A dense layer of oak leaf litter is perfect fuel for a ground fire. Now, the maples, on the other hand, have a lot less lignin in their leaves. Julie knows all of this because she did a lot of this work with us, working on the chemistry of leaf litter and its ecological functions. But maple leaves decompose over winter and are pretty almost skeletonized by the spring. And so they provide much less in the way of fuel. Now, one of the first things the Cary Arboretum in those days did was have volunteers go back through the original land survey deeds. So other than those pollen profiles, one of our best sources of information on the nature of the forest at the time of settlement was to go back to the original deeds and look at the trees recorded at the corners of lots by surveyors. These were known as witness trees. And the surveyors, they actually didn't call them hickories. They called them walnuts because there aren't any hickories in Europe, and the earliest surveyors thought they looked like walnuts. But nonetheless, you can go back to those deeds and ask what species are most frequently recorded. And in those witness trees from the surveys between about 1730 and 1750 for the Cary woods, 75% of the trees mentioned are oaks, and there are almost no maples recorded. The forests currently are about evenly balanced between oaks and maples. And the maples are not fire tolerant. And as I said, they also create litter that doesn't promote strong fires. And so the bottom line seems to be that our forests are becoming less flammable. Mohonk Preserve is very valiantly trying to do fire management. We have ecosystems like the Pine Barrens and the Shawngum Ridge that really desperately need to be managed with fire. It's a very difficult thing, particularly for land trusts to get all the fire companies in the state and the local towns organized around doing the necessary management. But the fact of the matter is that the disappearance of fires as a meaningful component of these oak forests is likely to just play out in continued decline in the abundance of oaks. And certainly one of the factors in that is that oaks tend to be just beloved by deer. They're a favorite browse. This is really a you know, the recovery of forests is in the Hudson Valley is paralleled by the recovery of deer. Not necessarily a good thing from the forest perspective. So, you know, deer were hunted almost to extinction in the Northeast. In fact, they were extirpated. They were eliminated from Connecticut and were reintroduced a little over 100 years ago in northwestern Connecticut. And in the late 1800s, the New York Game Commission estimated that there were likely less than a dozen deer left in the entire Catskill Mountain Range. In a typical recent year, almost 7,000 deer are legally harvested during the hunting season from the 5 wildlife management units in the Catskills. So this you know, basically between 1900 and World War II, deer hunting was banned in Western New York. The only viable deer population in New York was considered to exist deep in the snowier parts of the Adirondack Mountains. And so modern wildlife management and hunting laws were extraordinarily successful at restoring the deer. So much so that in many parts of the Hudson Valley and in many parts of the eastern US, deer browsing is a major factor reducing regeneration by trees. The other picture here is from a deer exposure study that Ray Winchcombe and I set up many years ago. I think Julie probably worked on that too. And it's sort of hard to see there, but there's a fence, and inside the fence is what a forest should look like without deer. And outside is the impact of deer. And this happens to be in a land owned by a hunt club, and they're not all that keen to see the deer herd reduced. The Cary, I'm very proud to say, through Ray Winchcombe and now Mike Fargione, has a really exemplary deer management program. If you go into our woods, you'll see very healthy regeneration because more than 40 years now of very deliberate management of the deer herd has kept it to a level that allows a very healthy understory. It's possible to do. It's getting harder and harder as land gets subdivided, and you know, there are more and more homes in the landscape. There are fewer areas where you can hunt. And so this is a problem that, you know, basically, I can't resist a few data slides. You know, basically, you know, more than half of northeastern forests have levels of seedlings and saplings that I consider to be insufficient for healthy reproduction and regeneration. We estimate that these levels reduce productivity by somewhere between 20 and 40%. A few years ago, Becky Shearer and Chris Zimmerman at TNC put out a report that tried to assemble all the data for New York and map it. And as you can see, you know, the areas, the green where there's decent regeneration are in fact those areas where deeper snows tend to keep the deer population down up in the northern Adirondacks. But much of the Hudson Valley and the Catskills have very poor tree regeneration. I don't see an easy solution for this. As I said, there are fewer hunters every year. There are fewer areas available to hunt. And cars turn out to be the leading cause of mortality to deer. I just had 2 coyotes trot through my woods this morning. I was excited because the previous morning, the 6 deer went in the other direction. So maybe the coyotes can help us. But I want to segue to logging. You know, this is something that is sort of invisible to many people in the Hudson Valley, but an important part of both the history of these forests and really, I would say probably one of the dominant factors structuring the nature of the landscape, that along with pests and pathogens I'll talk about in a minute. This came out of a study that an REU, one of our research experience for undergraduates, student wanted to do with me about 12 years ago now. She wanted some experience working with forest inventory data. And, you know, ecologists tend to study forests where there's not logged, and we leave the forests that are logged to be studied by the foresters. But what we learned from her project was that logging accounts for about half of all the trees that die in the eastern US die because a human being cut them down. This just was sort of mind-boggling to me. It's not a bad thing. Forests are one of humanity's oldest natural resources that can be sustainably and well managed to produce all sorts of valuable commodities. I'm an amateur boat builder and furniture maker, and so I'm quite keen to get. I was just at the mill yesterday picking up some cherry for a piece of furniture I'm working on. So and I have great respect for good forest management. But this is the issue. There's this perception that clear cutting is the dominant forestry in the Northeast, and that's simply not true. Fewer than on average about 10 to 15% of the area logged in any given year is clear cut. In fact, a forester would not call that picture, that would be called a variable retention patch cut, technically speaking, but it's more or less a clear cut. But the area to the left there is actually part of a much larger partial harvest. And it's really this partial harvesting that has become the dominant silviculture in the eastern US, outside of the southern pine and southern pine hardwood forests of the southeast coastal plain. It's still practiced to some degree in spruce fir forests and sadly in beech forests where beech bark disease is rampant and leading forestry companies to try to just eliminate it. But basically, this is what's happening now is mostly the selective logging. Foresters tend to not like partial harvesting or selective logging because they worry that it's what's known as high grading, where somebody comes in and just simply takes the really valuable trees without any concern to the future of the forest. I'm sympathetic to that view, although I do think that partial harvesting can be practiced well and can be done and can be good for the resilience and the health of the forest. But it does have impacts, and so it tends to work against oaks. The oaks tend to need more opening than a lot of partial harvesting produces. And so, this is just, along with deer in the absence of fire, partial harvesting again is leading to declines in the long-term abundance of oaks in our forests and promoting species like beech and sugar maple, hemlock, spruce, and fir that are more shade tolerant. I'm gonna skip talking about carbon offset markets. Some of you may have seen a blog post I did several years ago that got me fired from a Nature Conservancy chapter board because I find the carbon offset markets to be fraudulent at best, but that's a separate story. Just shifting gears here, for many years, many of us at the Cary have focused on the effects of various forms of air pollution on forests. Acid deposition, was the focus of both Gene Likens' pioneering research on acid rain, as well as an enormous amount of effort focused on forests during the 1980s when red spruce were dying en masse in many of the mountains of the Northeast. In fact, it was 1986. The New York Times had a headline, "Sugar Maple Faces Extinction," which surprised me because I had just finished my PhD on the ecology of sugar maple and beech, and beech was being threatened by beech bark disease, but the sugar maples were just the picture of health everywhere I looked at them. But there were areas where lesions were forming on leaves, and there was a lot of concern. This was clearly a case of a reporter looking for a catchy headline. There certainly was absolutely nothing that threatened extinction of sugar maple. In fact, sugar maple today is more common in the Northeast than at any time in the last 10,000 years, actually, because of its spread into oak forests. But certainly there are impacts of acid deposition and soil calcium depletion on the species like ashes and basswood that need base-rich soils. A lot of work was done on ozone exposure. Oddly enough, we get poor air quality from ozone due to nitrous oxides produced in New York City that waft up the valley and then cook up in sunlight. And so we tend to have higher ozone levels than New York City in a hot summer day. And that certainly has some impact on trees. A lot of work was done, often funded by the utility industries, because the idea was that all the CO2 being pumped into the atmosphere would fertilize and make trees grow faster. Trees become a little more water use efficient if they can take up the CO2 while losing less water. But the biggest effect has been the nitrogen deposition. You know, the Clean Air Act amendments were very successful in reducing sulfur dioxide emissions and deposition, less successful at reducing nitrous oxides and nitric acid deposition. And it turns out that nitrogen is fertilizer for many of these forests. And there are certainly species that suffer higher mortality, but we estimated, now almost 15 years ago, that the nitrogen pollution was essentially fertilizing northeastern forests significantly over what you would expect from pre-industrial levels. All of this by way of saying that these are all meaningful impacts. Just on my list of worries at night, they've all sort of dropped down. I suspect, you know, any land trust that has a preserve probably has preserve volunteers that go out and are concerned about invasive species. These have also dropped down on my list of concerns. I have to confess that invasive plants in forests tend to be about 30% of the plants in New York are non-native. Very few of them are invasive. Most of them were deliberately introduced or for gardens or for forestry or for agriculture. But there's species like garlic mustard and tree of heaven are becoming increasingly common in our forests. The question is, when does the introduction of these species lead to the decline of a native species? And that's harder to establish. Tree of heaven eventually will become more and more common in our forests, but right now it's still largely restricted to forest margins. Garlic mustard was everybody's favorite villain for a number of years. I sort of enjoy plucking it. It's a biennial, so if you yank it out before those flowers set seed, you pull it out. It pulls out easily by the roots. It's also edible. The leaves make a pesto that people claim is edible. I have never tried it. So you know, it's these forests are acquiring new species, but compared to invasives in wetlands and aquatic systems, the invasives we currently have in our forests are things that I've learned to live with, I have to confess. But this is a very different story, and these are the introductions that really truly have transformed our forests, and these are the introduced pests and pathogens. And most of you are familiar with this litany of species that have come in and decimated native tree species: chestnut blight, the Jelm disease, on and on and on. Beech leaf disease, the spotted lanternfly is the villain of the year at the moment, and I'm sure all of you have seen white ash trees dead and dying en masse. Really sort of heartbreaking. It's really of all of these introduced pests and pathogens, the emerald ash borer has spread more rapidly than just about anything, and more thoroughly. There are about 15 species of ashes in North America. Some of them are very rare species out in rivers in the West, but you know, all of the species of ash appear to be at risk. And this is a slide I like to show just to get everybody's attention. You know, this is the number of non-native forest pests per county based on Sandy Leopold's data from over a decade ago now. The numbers have just gotten higher. And this is basically a function of the introduction through, we know the routes by which these species are introduced, the live plant trade and the solid wood packing. And so both of those, and they're particularly coming from either Europe or Asia. These are species that come over on the plants or in an insect in the wood. And when they arrive in New York, they tend to find species very similar to the hosts that they came from in Europe and Asia, which have maples and oaks and very many closely related species. So I'm going to skip this. I did my PhD on the ecology of sugar maple and beech at a time when beech bark disease had not yet spread into the Five Ponds wilderness, at that time the largest known tract of old growth forest in eastern North America. Those beech forests were just spectacular. Since then, only a few % of them are resistant to the disease, and most of them look like that tree near Mark Twain, with fully cankered and heavily diseased and dying. Fortunately or unfortunately, the disease only kills the larger trees. Beech sprouts prolifically from its roots. And so beech is still a common tree. It just very rarely gets to be a full mature tree producing the beech seeds that are so valuable to wildlife. And I can't talk about this without recognizing our dear friend, Gary Levitt, a colleague here at Cary. Gary and I started pretty much the same time and retired exactly the same day in 2021. And Gary and I both spent many years working on introduced pests and pathogens. And finally, Gary got to the point where he was tired of doing the research to show just how damaging they were and decided that it was time to try to do something about it. And so he came up with this Tree Smart Trade Initiative, which I think has just been brilliant. Gary very tragically passed away a couple of years ago, and the Institute is looking to carry on this work. Basically, we know the problem. We just need to stop the introduction of these insects through the live plant trade and the solid wood packing. And then we also need the scientists trained in finding biological control once these things do get established. And so I think this was just a case where, decades of doing the research finally convinced Gary that being a scientist wasn't enough, that we needed to act. Something I was just always immensely proud of him for this. So I'm going to wrap up by just, talking. I can't give a talk about forests without talking about climate change. This is also fairly low on my list of immediate concerns, which is going to sound weird. But I've been working on climate impacts on trees for almost 30 years now. And we're frankly I have concluded that the temperate trees of Eastern North America may be the most climate resilient organisms on the planet. You have to think about the evolution of temperate trees. These are species whose primary evolutionary trait has been the tolerance of wildly fluctuating climate, particularly cold climates, because most of our trees are from the descendants of tropical lineages that are here in the temperate zone because they can tolerate freezing and cold winter temperatures. But our trees have incredibly broad climate distributions, often span a range of 10 degrees centigrade or more. So the mean annual temperature right here in Mid-Dutchess County is about 8 or 9 degrees C, depending on elevation and so forth. And so for many of these species, an increase in temperature of 2 to 3 degrees centigrade would actually be predicted at equilibrium, which I've already told you I don't believe happens, but could easily be expected to increase their abundance locally. There are species, balsam fir in particular, that is sort of right at its climatic limit in the Catskills, for instance. And it's also one of the few species we've studied where it's the survival of adults is very sensitive to climate. And so I do expect, and our models do predict, that balsam fir could disappear quite rapidly with any warming. But what we have found is that the adults and even the saplings are largely buffered from climate. In fact, our most recent research shows that these species are largely responding to variation year to year in local climate. In other words, they've adapted to what the local climate. Now, we don't know if that's genetic or and fixed, and therefore a challenge for them as the climate change, or whether it represents acclimation that they have acclimated during their lifetime to whatever they experience. And in that case, if that's the case, then as climate change, they may well acclimate and tolerate whatever the climate change is. So, you know, we have just finished essentially the 20 years of work, literally in the last couple of weeks, to build all of this, you know, these years of analyses into our computer models and run it under different climate scenarios. And yes, you know, we do expect declines in productivity, shifts in species abundance, but you know, modest relative to the very broad distributions of most of these tree species. So, this is I'm not going to say a lot about this, but you know, as an ecologist, I'm most concerned with how climate change could alter these forests. An awful lot of the discussion about forests and climate these days is on the notion of forests as natural climate solutions, a term that I have come to dislike intensely. Conservation organizations decided that instead of you know, being the doomsayers and talking about just all the threats from climate change to native ecosystems and species, that maybe these ecosystems could in fact help get us out of this mess. I disagree with that. I think there've been the potential for forests to mitigate climate change through greater carbon sequestration have been grossly exaggerated. And we're going to have to work hard to keep the carbon sink that we have in our forests. Eastern forests are more than 80% of the nation's terrestrial land carbon sink. They're incredibly important. They're even globally significant carbon sinks. I just see very few practical or even feasible ways to increase that. And it's going to take real work to maintain what we have in the way of that. So I'm going to wrap up here. So what have I learned? I've been working on these forests for at least 40 years. It's a little more than that now that I think about it. You know, and I come back to this notion of drift. Trees are very long-lived organisms. They are remarkably well buffered and resilient in the sense that they survive, adapt, and can regenerate. But they are drifting along in response to all these different currents: deer, pests and pathogens, you know, change in fire regimes, and on and on. But you know, many of these changes are not just inexorable, but predictable. And those are the broad outlines of succession, that under partial harvesting, we're going to see more and more abundance of shade-tolerant tree species. That's just hard to get that just seems inevitable. But this notion of steady state and this notion of a primeval state in particularly as a touchstone for conservation strategies, is something that I've had to learn to abandon. I just don't think it's either realistic or useful in thinking about the nature of these systems. These legacies play out over hundreds, if not thousands, of years, and yet we still have, you know, functioning ecosystems with a lot of ecological integrity. But we do have to accept that we're not going back to some notion of a primeval forest. The novel conditions are here, and there are going to be more and more. And so this is, I think, a real challenge for us to think it, because it puts the you know, the responsibility on us to think about how we want to manage these ecosystems. You know, this notion of just, you know, there's been a lot of debate among philosophers and conservation biologists about wilderness. Just what does that mean when human impacts are so pervasive? And I think that's a debate that's worth having. So I'm going to stop there. I will stop sharing. And I talked longer. I promised Julie that I would stop by 7 at the latest. My apologies for that. But I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
Thank you, Charlie, and no apologies necessary. I could have listened to that for a lot longer. It's a lot to think about. So we'll be sending a follow-up email to everyone with a list of resources and links to the Cary Institute website, as well as the recording of this webinar. I can see there's already some good questions in the Q&A box, so keep those coming. Before we dive into the Q&A, I just want to remind you that our next webinar is Wednesday, March 5th, and our speaker will be Amy Stewart, who is the author of The Tree Collectors, Tales of Arboreal Obsession. And I hope that we will see you all there. And now let's dive into the Q&A. And the first question, this really resonates with me, and you'll see why. Has acid rain in the Adirondacks and the Northeast had any impact on tree species decline in our forests? And this question came in, I think, before you had the acid rain slide up, so you've probably answered this mostly already.
Far greater impact on aquatic systems. Acid rain was, Charlie Driscoll gives these wonderful talks saying that, yes, the Clean Air Act has reduced acid loading enough that lakes will recover, but it'll take 100 years. And getting the trout back is problematic. The bizarre thing is that red spruce really did take a hit in the 1980s, and air pollution was very intense. Red spruce regeneration now is so thick in the woods. Those of you who know spruce know that you identify a spruce because it's painful to walk through a thicket of spruce because those needles are sharp. Red spruce is doing phenomenally well. There was wonderful research done. There are lots of ways that acid rain impacted many tree species, sugar maples and red spruce. But I guess I would have to say that the Clean Air Act amendments were wildly successful. Yes, there's still nitrogen loading that's important, but it's hard for me to see a long-lasting effect. I think we've, the lasting effects are in aquatic systems, not in the forests.
Thank you, Charlie. I'll be giving out the next question here. This question, I think, was posed when you were presenting a couple different species as indicators. This person asked if finding a trout lily in the woods uphill from the low stone wall behind their house suggests that the woods were not farmed or cleared.
It would to me. Although I had pink lady slippers, orchids in my woods 40 years ago. And this was a dairy farm. My neighborhood was a dairy farm 80 years ago. And so it's not always the case, but it does suggest your soils are a little richer than typical. And so for instance, some of the best spring ephemerals are in the Taconic-Hereford multiple use area, which was a cattle feedlot for many years. And so I think the farming actually enriched the soil. So I should back off from thinking that you only find them in these, but so we had some agricultural soils that were really depleted, and they became the pastures, and they're really pretty dry and droughty and not the place you'd look for a trout lily. Some of the agricultural lands were enriched by farmers over years and could well be where you would find the spring ephemerals now. So yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, it's interesting the signs that are left in the land from past uses and how they manifest themselves. That's really interesting. So the next question is asking about a New York State initiative to plant millions of trees over the next 5 years or so. Is that something that you're aware of? And if so, can you talk about?
Yeah, I bless them. I find it frustrating and more than passing strange. The Nature Conservancy is very big on this. So that if you look at the lands available that make sense to plant trees in, they represent one of the disappearing habitats in our landscape, namely the old fields, right? And so, and there are lots of wildlife species that depend on those old fields, and they are a vanishing resource in this landscape, as you well know from the Cary. We had beautiful old fields and little bluestem meadows and gray dogwood thickets, and they've all grown up to young forests. And when the trees come in, you go through this biodiversity bottleneck. The trees shade out all of those old field species, and there's really nothing in the understory. And so those young forests are biological deserts. And so I keep pointing out that you can get the carbon benefits from 1 acre of solar panels than you get from almost 1,000 acres of reforestation. Do the numbers, folks. It makes no sense to plant trees as a natural climate solution in this part of the world. It's using up valuable habitat, and Nature Conservancy estimates that it costs $7,000 to $8,000 an acre to plant trees, and there's no guarantee the deer won't eat them all. So put up an acre of solar panels and leave those old fields alone. I'm sorry, it's not a sensible solution. Everybody loves to plant trees. Everybody likes trees. But thinking of it as a meaningful offset to our carbon emissions is just based on math that doesn't work.
Okay, I think that's good for everyone to know. There's also a follow-up question in here, extending on that, asking about the types of trees that are being planted and are they the right kind? And I don't know do we know what species are being proposed?
Well, I don't know what they're going to plant. I mean, one of the real limitations is that where do you get those trees? Do we have enough nurseries producing them? And do we have good local seed sources for native species? But the real problem is just, with current deer densities, planting trees, unless you're willing to either fence or put the tree tubes around them and keep them alive until they get taller than the deer can, you're just feeding deer. And it's I think it's misguided in my opinion.
Yeah, one phrase that I've come back to a lot is to suggest that people don't plant trees, grow trees. If you're going to go to the trouble of putting a tree seedling in the ground, you have to water it if there's a drought. You have to protect it from deer, or it's not going to live.
Trees have been phenomenally successful at getting established on their own, right? And so the notion that we would spend public funds and to do it when it's really not going to sequester enough carbon to matter seems there are an awful lot of people at DEC spending an awful lot of time trying to figure out how to implement the governor's initiative on this.
Sounds like a nice initiative at the headlines, right? So the next question is kind of a follow-up to that a little bit, but then also you partially answered this during your presentation as well. But how does carbon sequestration and carbon buybacks play into the sustainability of our forest? And I know that you covered kind of
Eastern forests are, as I said, a globally significant carbon sink. And they are because we cut them all down 200 years ago and they're regrowing. I just published a paper last year. There's a sort of a myth in forestry that only young forests are still actively sequestering carbon. That's simply not true. Our forests, in fact, it's hard to show at what point. Eventually, an old growth forest does stop sequestering carbon in live biomass, continues to store it in dead wood and soil and so forth. But we're nowhere near that. We have our models and our analyses and our papers suggest we have about 100 years of continued, very steady, strong accumulation of carbon in forests of the eastern United States. This is the question is, can you boost that significantly? So, for instance, the Nature Conservancy's estimate comes from proposing to halt all logging on 300 million acres of eastern forests for the next 25 years. And let them grow. They will grow faster if you halt logging. But but by halting logging, you've just caused leakage and driven logging to the tropics where the destruction is far worse. In that paper, they do say, well, we'll need to plant 17 million acres of fast growing conifers to make up the lost harvest. But I'm sorry, that's just nonsense. There aren't 17 million acres readily available for planting. It takes a long time to get the carbon in, And, you don't replace the production of saw logs of white oak and black cherry and sugar maple with plantations of eucalypts or radiata pine. So it's yeah, it's been very frustrating to me that there's just not a lot of rational thinking going on here. There's a lot of idealism that's driving policy.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to the complexity of
Mhm.
all of these issues and the complexity of the systems themselves and trying to manage them. Now, here's a question that I think was asked before you got to your invasive species slide, but they're asking, have invasive species gone on to affect the restoration of forests?
Well, the funny thing is, if I were giving this talk in Westchester, I'd have to be saying very different things. So we are lucky in that we are just north of the distribution of a lot of vines. So vines, lianas, tend to be tropical species. They don't do well in hard freezes. They don't tend to invest in wood that can be restored after freezing. And so we don't get a lot of the sort of really dense vine infestations that happen south of us, and particularly in more urban forests where you have a whole suite of things: soil compaction, heavy metal contamination, more air pollution, and just the canopy opening up and then invasives taking over en masse and what's known as invasional meltdown, where just the system just sort of implodes. We don't, although I have to say, we're starting to see more and more of that as our winters get warmer. I'm seeing things that I would expect to see in New Jersey, but I'm now seeing here in the Hudson Valley. So, but right now, I pulled all the honeysuckle out of my woods, because if you pull in the right direction, it comes right out of the ground. Honeysuckle has this weird rooting habit. If you figure out which direction, you can pull it in that direction and just peel it out of the ground. I have no idea why I didn't like honeysuckle in my woods. The small mammals love it. So a lot of the shrubs in our woods are non-native, particularly these post-agricultural forests. There are very few of the native shrubs in those woods, and yet those non-native shrubs, particularly the honeysuckles, I dislike multiflora rose for various reasons, because it's hard to get through. But many of the non-native shrubs are the main structure in the understory of these post-agricultural forests, and there are birds and small mammals that use that as habitat. And so burning bush is everybody's favorite shrub to pull out. I planted some years ago, and the gardeners at the Cary made me dig it up. But I've now had some coming in the woods out my window, and I think it's lovely in the fall. And I'm not going to pull it out because it's having no impact on tree regeneration, particularly inside my deer fence where things are doing quite well. So again, there are certainly cases where specific sites where, but again, when I think about invasive plants that concern me, it's Phragmites and wetlands, where, incredibly diverse ecosystems that can be just converted into monocultures of Phragmites. So an upland forest is, again, by my standards, far less vulnerable to that kind of, those kind of really concerning invasions.
I appreciate you painting that kind of gray area of invasive management, right? Better than just going and pulling it all out. It's kind of better to understand the whole system there and what's nesting and hanging out there.
We just don't have the resources to, well, that's not true. So if you have a preserve that has some, native species that, individual preserves can be managed, right? But you just can't stop them at the landscape or the regional scale. They're established, and I just can't make the case that the resources need to be spent to eradicate them. As I said, 30% of the plant species in New York are non-native. Many of them have been here for 200, 300, 400 years, and they're now naturalized part of the landscape.
Everything was native at one point.
Mm-hmm.
We have another question coming in regarding some state legislation, I believe. And I don't know much about this, so I'll see if you do, Charlie. Can you comment on the Fix the Forest legislation that is being proposed? Isn't it somewhat disingenuous in really fixing the forest?
I don't know that. I think my head is spinning so much from things going on in Congress in the last couple of weeks that I haven't seen anything about forest, and that's maybe been just because there's too much noise. But no, I don't. I can't comment on that because I don't know anything about that. I mean, there is discussion in New York State about revising forest tax law, and this comes up every few years. A significant fraction of Dutchess County and, parcels with forests more than 50 acres that meet the 480A level are in this forest tax law program that gives the landowners a very large reduction in their property taxes. In return, they have to manage the forest, and eventually when they log, they have to return to the towns some fraction of the stumpage receipts to make up for the lost tax revenue. And there have always been proposals to expand that or modify it. And there are current proposals being discussed. There's a public hearing process going on right now that you can find out about on the web.
And another question about legislation has popped into the box, asking about deer hunting. Has New York State considering changing hunting regulations to permit hunters to harvest more deer to get the population down to something that's less damaging to the environment?
Well, they already do. So, landowners can, with more than a certain amount of acreage, can get. I should defer to Mike Fargione because my knowledge of New York State hunting regulations is pretty modest. I love it when my neighbor gets a deer and I get some of the venison, but I don't hunt. So, I like to think that the Cary's Hunt program helped convince the state over the years that the problem is you need to be willing to shoot does, but hunters were indoctrinated that, just like Smokey the Bear and don't let fires happen, only shoot the bucks and don't shoot the does, and that'll rebuild the population. Well, if you really want to control a deer population, you have to shoot the females, the does, the reproducing animals. Just shooting the bucks won't reduce the reproductive output of the population. And so it's really more a matter of changing hunter behavior to get, all hunters will say they understand that they can improve the health of the deer herd by bringing it down, but they still want to see lots of deer out in the woods, and they still have a hard time shooting a doe. And that's just been drummed into them for decades. So I think it's more hunter behavior than state laws that need to change.
I've seen a little shift in conservation conversation with hunters recently, especially maybe younger ones as well. So where the education is, we can do a good job, right? I am going to say that we have about 5 minutes left on the clock tonight before 7:30 and a plethora of questions. So we'll try to combine and maybe move a little quicker, but I apologize that we might not be able to get to all of your questions tonight. But in that consideration of time, next question is, do you consider bittersweet a threat to the forest? We all see them strangling trees.
Yeah, this is one of the new, I mentioned this, I'm seeing things that 20 years ago, I would not have seen. And I should be cautious. I really have no way of knowing. Again, in these, urban forests, it's very common to see this sort of, the combined effects of all of these stresses really lead to degradation. I tend to be, as I think you can probably tell, more impressed with the resilience of these more rural forests. So we often, our initial reaction is also often and justifiably concern, and it's hard to predict exactly what the impact will be. I've worked on a lot of different invasive species. Julie may remember the two postdocs who worked on Tree of Heaven and Norway maple, and they were both actually pretty depressed when our models predicted that both wouldn't really be an issue for about 300 years. It was going to take them, they were going to become very common, but it wasn't going to happen in the next 10 years. And so it wasn't going to make headlines, their research. And so it's just, it's hard to know, your only chance of controlling one of these things is in the early stages. It's really hard. And so this is a real challenge, knowing when to invest the resources to try to stop something at a time when you could. And this is particularly the case with pests and pathogens. Our only real hope is early in the infestation. And I spent a lot of years working with APHIS, the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, trying to use our models to understand when and how, what aspects of a new pest or pathogen might tell you whether it was in fact going to become truly devastating or not. And that's a really hard challenge.
Yeah. Now we do have quite a lot of questions still in chat and that we won't have time to get to. So I apologize if we aren't answering your specific question. A lot of them are really specific to certain species, but there's a common thread through a lot of them. So I'm going to ask this as our last question of the evening. What is the most impactful way that average citizens of the Hudson Valley can contribute to ecological health here?
Support anything that reduces CO2 emissions, the decarbonization of our energy supply, right? So, climate change really is the overarching and threat going forward. New York has been a leader. Governor, the CLCPA, the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act, was a really dramatic and important effort. It needs to go forward. And, I think you can get involved, again, at the level of your woods. I'm not sure I'd want you to go out and pull out all the honeysuckle, even though I do weed out the garlic mustard. I'm not really sure why. It feels good. I think you can be a good steward of the land. And, you go to places like Julie and ask for information about what you can do. Every piece of forest is going to have slightly different challenges. But I still find the web to be a pretty good source of information. Wikipedia is often fairly accurate. A lot of state agencies will post good information on invasives and what you can do. So I think stewardship sort of is really where stewardship at the local level, and then sort of political support for the big things that have to change. With tree smart trade is incredibly important. Exactly what someone locally has as a lever on that is a good question. So.
That's a great answer, Charlie. I appreciate it. Start local, right? That's something we all got to keep in mind. We don't have it in our powers to make a great deal of changes on the state and federal level. So work within your community and support your plant community.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, with that, I think that's a great combination of questions, Julie. I appreciate you doing that. And Charlie, we appreciate you very much. I hope to get you out to our preserve one day soon to apply some of your knowledge to, as we put the puzzle pieces together of how to manage our own landscape. And then we'll be able to use education out there as a way to help inform folks that are on this webinar tonight what they can do with their landscape. So yeah, I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Reminder, an email will go out with the recording of this webinar, as well as links of things that Charlie had mentioned tonight. And yeah, just want to thank everyone. Thank you again, Charlie. Thank you, Julie and Doug. And thank you everyone for attending. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys.
All right.
Thank you.
Night,
Have a good
everybody.
night, everyone.
Good evening.